Shall we take a vote? How many people want to have Darwin? All right.
Okay. Okay, I'll try. I hope I can do it because there's a lot to compress, but I think I've got something in 10 minutes. The first thing about Darwin is that what he did was to take the idea of evolution, which was very much discussed in his time in a number of different ways, and to transform it. I don't suppose anyone today still has the idea that somehow that Darwin discovered the idea of evolution as well, but certainly a few years ago we used to still talk as if Darwin had discovered this. The idea of evolution came in again through cultural historical context. It's not completely clear all the different routes to which it came. It seems to have arisen in a number of different places, different times, and certainly one can also, if one wishes to, relate it back to Greek philosophy. But basically, when Darwin went to Edinburgh as a medical student, he found the idea of evolution was much discussed there. It came through from the French, particularly. Obviously Lamarck, everybody knows about Lamarck. But more than that, there are other people, such as the philosophical anatomist Geoffroy de Saint-Hilaire, who developed an idea of evolution based on a unity of plan, morphological unity of plan, quite different from Lamarck's and so on. And this was much discussed among the people that Darwin knew in Edinburgh at that time. So he learnt it quite early on. And of course his own grandfather had written a book on evolution before. Then, of course, he moved in different circles, and there's this famous question of the voyage of the Beagle, about which I shan't say very much, except to say one very interesting thing about Darwin's finches, which people go on about so much. The beaks, and noticing the beaks are different, and each different beak goes with a slightly different niche and so on and that, so they can all survive in the same place and all that kind of thing. In fact, Darwin didn't notice this at all. It's rather like Herschel and the planet Uranus. He got it wrong. He was a very, very good collector, very careful, but it's a very strange thing happened to him when he went to the Galapagos. He collected very badly. He was a very careful collector, but for some reason in the Galapagos he did not label his specimens properly. And he'd never done this anywhere else. And he didn't label which island they came from, these different creatures. And when he got back to England, he wasn't interested in these birds at all. And he said, I've got a mixture of birds here. He said, there's finches, there's wrens, there's mockingbirds, and some other kind of thing. And he gave them to a man called Gould at the Zoological Society, who was a zoologist and a very famous illustrator. And Gould, because Darwin wanted to make lots of books of all these journeys, and Gould went and looked at these and drew them and so on. And it was Gould who discovered they were all different species of finches. And he told Darwin, and Darwin was very shocked and somewhat embarrassed because he realised he hadn't labelled them properly, so he didn't know what island they'd come from, islands. And he had been told by the Spanish governor of the Galapagos that the tortoises there were different on each different island, and you could tell from the carapace. And Darwin said, oh, no, he said they weren't tortoises. He said these were brought in by buccaneers. And he never checked up at all. They collected a lot of tortoises and took them back with them and ate them on board boat, and then chucked the carapaces into the sea. But of course, by this time, Darwin realised he'd chucked the evidence overboard before it even had become evidence. He'd eaten it. He actually ate the evidence for evolution. Very, very Victorian. And Gould, somehow or other, Gould got it in the morning papers about these finches that Darwin had discovered. So Darwin got famous for these finches, and he hadn't even realised. So it's just the same here as the planet Uranus. Anyway. Eventually, he begins to come to this idea long before he said it is. I know in his notebooks that this notion of what he called transformism, the transformation of one species into another, was probably true, and he started to investigate this in all sorts of ways. And he started out with the idea that this was so. And to begin with, he seems to have thought of it in quite Lamarckian terms. He talks, for example, about in his notebooks about a mammal whose habitat might get flooded a lot, and he says, well, this animal will sort of learn to paddle with its paws, and this behaviour will eventually become instinctive, and this will actually cause the animal to actually change from paws to flippers. It's a completely Lamarckian point of view that he has at the beginning. And it's really quite a lot a lot later before he begins to move away from this. And he comes up with the idea in his notebooks, because his notebooks are voluminous, but he comes up with the idea. He investigates breeders. He was very keen on that. Everybody knows that because he was a countryman. And he sees how with the breeders, what happens is you get a random change in an organism, and the breeder will select it and propagate that. And he actually says that that's completely different to how nature works. And in his notebooks, he sees nature and the breeders working in a completely different way. And he does so for quite a long time. And then comes a point when it must have been because of all this experience with breeders, he conceives the idea that perhaps the change that takes place in an organism could be a random, sudden, small variation, as happens with breeders, and not this Lamarckian adaptation and then growing a new organ and so on and that, but it could be random. And it dawns on him, and it puts it in the most funny way around, that he says, good heavens, he says, what probably happens is that nature imitates the breeders. And it's quite astonishing. You think, hang on a minute, because really what he means is that the breeders are actually imitating nature. And he doesn't put it that way. He says nature imitates the breeders, and he does see that as a big step forward, because then he gets this idea of natural selection. Well, I say he gets the idea of natural selection, but Patrick Matthew in Edinburgh in 1845 has written a whole book on this. He was a timber merchant, and he wrote a whole book on ideas of natural selection and competition and so on, which would certainly be known to Darwin. So that might have been something that helped Darwin on his way. It's now, of course, all attributed to Darwin because, as in the case I talked about, we never look at the total situation. At first, he thinks that this doesn't happen very much in nature. And he thinks that when an organism appears, it's actually already acclimatized to its new environment. And he thinks, for the most part, there isn't much variation at all. That's a rather important point. He thinks it's quite a rare thing, this variation. But what really changed his mind was his experience with the barnacles. Now, he spent 10 years writing up and illustrating, with the help of a lot of other people, all his work on the voyage of the Beagle. And the last thing he had to do was one tiny fossilized barnacle from Chile. And he thought this wouldn't actually take him very long, so he'd finish it off. It actually took him 7 to 8 years and thoroughly exhausted him. But he had to get other barnacles with which to compare it. And the interesting thing about this is that years ago, people, when I was a student, for example, people always used to say, why is it that when Darwin had this marvellous theory of evolution, already written down in a book, that he then didn't publish it and actually went off and wasted all those years studying barnacles? Now, the barnacles, I think, were one of the most important things he ever did. What's more, he didn't have his theory of evolution written down in a book. He had a book, he'd written it in the early 1840s, by 1844, a sketch. And what is in there is actually very different indeed from what finally emerges as his theory of evolution. It's actually very Lamarckian. But we grew up with the idea, he got this theory, put it in a book, put it on one side, gone off and wasted his time for 10 years with barnacles. And none of this is true. He hadn't got the theory at all that we know as Darwin's theory of evolution. And the work on barnacles, far from being a waste of time, was very important, because when he got into this work, what he found was, as it were, the barnacles would never keep still. They were always varying. He discovered the most incredible degree of variation happening all the time in front of his eyes. So from the point of view of a systematist trying to systematize them and so on, it was a nightmare. From the point of view of a man who had incipient ideas about evolution, it was a godsend, because he was seeing in front of his eyes variation happening, not as he'd thought, only very occasionally, but as he said, they are eminently variable. And he saw the variation as ubiquitous. It was the norm. And in fact, there is a gestalt switch here, rather like the duck-rabbit, because where other people simply saw variations in a species, he saw incipient new species coming up. Each of these variants for him began to become the possibility of a new species. But, see, it was very interesting in terms of Goethe, because Goethe saw something rather similar in terms of plant life. But what Goethe realized was that he was coming up, as it were, to the very quality of livingness itself, the quality of life, because for life to remain life, it has to continually become different in order to remain itself. Otherwise it would be dead. So it's the very quality of life to produce self-difference, to produce difference within itself, diversity within unity. And this is what Goethe saw. So Goethe really experienced the livingness of things as the phenomenon. He, as it were, Goethe reached the phenomenon of life, saw what it was. Darwin never saw what it was. He was right there in front of him, rather than a hidden figure. He never saw this. And he comes up there and he thinks like a physicist. He says, why does nature do this? There must be an explanation. I must find a reason why this happens. Instead of seeing that what he's seeing is the phenomenon and really seeing into it so it becomes visible what livingness is, he wants an explanation, rather like a physicist would do. He wants to know why nature produces all these variations. And this puzzles him for quite a long time. And he tells us, and this is where we come to the intrinsic historicality, he tells us in his autobiography that he remembers the moment where it happens and he stopped the carriage, where it hit him. The answer was the division of labour. Now, this is for Darwin utterly fundamental, and I want to take this notion of the division of labour. This is now towards the end. What year was this book posted? I can't remember. 1856 was it? Margaret, what year was it?
1859.
59, thank you. It's good. I thought it was at first, now I thought it was a bit earlier. It's good, it was the end of a decade. Now, he comes up and he says, this is, what's happening here is the division of labour. That's the key idea. It then took him several more years to work it out. What happens here is this. Division of labour was not just flavour of the month, it was flavour of the decade. The whole idea of the division of labour was fundamental to the new entrepreneurial, competitive, industrial, economic, marketplace capitalism. Adam Smith talked about it, the whole idea, and Darwin, who was a very rich man, Darwin's grandfather, Darwin's wife's father, had actually started one of the first production line factories in the Midlands for pottery, moving away from craft to production line, where, as you know, each person does one bit only. Adam Smith had talked about this in I think it was in Wealth of Nations or not, I can't remember. But the point about the division of labour, what they realised was that you could vastly increase your productive output by having a number of people each doing one part of the process only on a production line. And this was held to be a marvellous new discovery. Darwin's father's library was full of books on economics and manufacture. So Darwin grew up with this, and Darwin was a very heavy investor in this kind of industry. He was very keen on it because it gave him a very big return on his money, and he was a staggeringly rich man. At the beginning of the decade, Prince Albert, whom everybody took notice of, unlike Prince Charles, more or less the opposite, but Prince Albert, when he said something, they took notice. There was the Lord Mayor of London gave a banquet 1 year before the Great Exhibition of 1851 for all the foreign ambassadors, the government ministers, and the mayors of 180 boroughs. And Prince Albert gave a speech. And in this speech, he talked about the division of labour in these terms. The great principle of division of labour, which may be called the moving power of civilization, he went on to say, is being extended to all branches of science, industry and art. Now, when Prince Albert said it was the moving power of civilization, you took notice. So this idea was, the division of labour, was looked upon as a universal principle of tremendous importance. Shortly after that, the journalist philosopher Herbert Spencer got hold of it and wrote a book about it, and said that he thought that this was probably what was actually happening in nature. This is the early 1850s. Darwin comes up with it later in the 1850s, and so on. What he saw was this. He said, what happens is, why does nature produce all these variants? Well, he doesn't understand, he's seeing the very quality of livingness which must continually change in order to remain itself, otherwise it's dead. That what he wants an explanation, and he says, well, there is great competition for food. Now, if different animals in the same place develop slightly different characteristics, so they can all feed in slightly different niches, they can all live in the same space without getting in each other's way, and there will be a vast increase in the number of species possible. And he called this process nature's manufactory of species. Manufactory was the old name for what we call a factory. And what he talked about it as being like a city, like London, where you've got a huge number of people who all live together, all doing small little jobs or parts of jobs and so on, don't get in each other's way because they've all honed to their own individual niche. And he saw the animals as being honed to their individual niche, like it would be if you thought about the finches again, the different shaped finch beaks give them slightly different feeding patterns, so they can live in slightly different niches, all in the same physical space, which can therefore have in it a great many more species than would otherwise be possible. And he's therefore simply talked about his process of evolution as being the division of labour, nature's division of labour, as it was in industry. Adrian Desmond and Moore, in their book on Darwin, have a lovely phrase. This is that Darwin was a very, very rich man. He'd invested heavily in this kind of thing, and he simply put his mouth where his money was. And here we have, in fact, the central idea of entrepreneurial, competitive, industrial capitalism of the market economy brought straight into the form of the scientific theory and says this is how evolution happens. He produced, in this case, and therefore he could say, as with society, so with nature, and therefore this society, to which I, Darwin, belong, is in fact the mirror image of nature, and that guarantees that this is the right kind of society. So he produced the industrial idealization of nature in this kind of way. It's an astonishing thing. And that's sort of built in to Darwin's theory. It's therefore an expression of the cultural historical context in which it was formed. Once you understand this, you begin to understand this whole question of Darwin's approach to evolution in a quite new kind of way, I suggest, and a way which is actually very illuminating. Because you will be left with the question, well, you want to ask the question, in what sense then is this true? This doesn't say it isn't true, just like what I said about Copernicus doesn't mean that it isn't true. But you will realise it doesn't have the kind of absolute foundations that scientists claim for it. Darwin himself says in his autobiography, I base my work, on observation. Oh, no, he didn't. He did a great deal of observation, but he didn't base his idea on observation. He did an enormous amount of observation and experimental work to back things up and to investigate things. But he didn't derive the idea from observation in the way in which he tries to tell you that he did. And of course, if you think it's derived from observation, then you say, well, you can't argue with it then, can you? Because it's true. But it isn't. And here we've got this. Scientific knowledge is intrinsically historical, and Darwin's theory is certainly an example of this. I'll stop now.